Welcome to today's Energy Industry Update webcast. The waiting is the hardest part, hosted by Energy Central and presented by Scott Madden. Now I'm happy to turn the floor over to our moderator, Kristen Lyons, partner and energy practice leader with Scott Madden. Kristen, welcome to the event. You have the floor.
Thank you, PJ, and welcome everyone to this webinar featuring insights from our latest Energy Industry Update. As PJ said, I am Kristen Lyons. I lead Scott Madden's energy practice, and I've been working in the industry for going on 25 years. So a brief introduction to who Scott Madden is. We are general management consultants, and we specialize in energy. We work in generation, transmission and distribution, the grid edge, rates and regulation, natural gas, and energy corporate services. We publish the Energy Industry Update twice a year, and it highlights what we see as really the most important things that our clients should be thinking about. The theme of this EIU is the waiting, as in it being the hardest part. And it seems that we are waiting for a lot of things to happen in different parts of the industry right now. Better said, there's a lot emerging right now, and it's not yet clear how it's all going to shake out. So to that end, we're going to focus on three topics that we wrote about in the EIU. The first is the energy transition in Denmark. So this is a small country with huge ambitions, and it's not yet clear how that's going to shake out in the coming years. Secondly, we're going to talk about some of the things that have developed at FERC recently. We've had some really rulings that have moved the needle, but it's not yet clear how implementation is going to work. And last but not least, we're going to talk about virtual power plants, which are certainly emerging, and at least personally, I'm waiting to see if they live up to the promises that have been touted. So with that, let's turn to Denmark. Next slide, please. So Kevin Hernandez is going to lead this discussion. Next slide, please. He is a partner in our Raleigh office, and he's been with the firm since 2012 and leads much of our work in the grid edge space. He and I recently participated in a fact-finding mission to Denmark, which has informed much of what you're about to hear about. Over to you, Kevin.
Thanks, Kristen. Next slide, please. So as Kristen mentioned, last summer, we had the opportunity to join a group of U.S. energy leaders on a SEPA fact-finding mission to Denmark, and we got a chance to meet with some energy leaders there and learn a little bit about the energy transition that they're going through and that they're experiencing. And so to provide a little bit of orientation to the Danish energy system, it's really not an exaggeration to say that in Denmark, in many ways, is really at the center of Europe's clean energy transition, and really in more ways than one. Not only is Denmark located in one of Europe's traditional centers of energy production in the North Sea, it's really located right there in the center between Norway, Sweden to the north and east, Germany and Netherlands to the south, mainland Europe to the south, and the UK to the west. That's not to mention, of course, to the extreme east, Russia, which we'll talk about throughout the presentation today. Besides this geographic location, Denmark maintains a strong network of interconnections to the European system. That includes HVDC ties, 5 of them, 3 with Norway and 1 each with the Netherlands and the United Kingdom, as well as traditional interconnections with Germany and Sweden. The interconnected nature of the Danish electric system really allows them a lot of significant resource flexibility, and we're going to talk a lot about that later. But it's really going to be a key to the path to the market to exporting energy, clean energy, which is really about a lot of what their energy transition is about. Next slide. So we'll start here, and we'll start by saying that Denmark has not always been a clean energy pioneer. Their transition began, and it's really taken place over a couple of different phases, but it began with the oil crisis in the 1970s, which caused the Danish, like a lot of countries, to consider the security of supply that at the time was based on oil imports. So the 1970s crisis pushed Denmark, as well as other North Sea nations, the UK and Norway in particular, to explore for resources in the North Sea basin, which, as many of you are aware, has resulted in decades of natural gas and oil production. In fact, Danish natural gas production accelerated all throughout the 1980s and 90s and only peaked in the early 2000s. In 2020, Denmark signed its first binding climate act, which included an agreement to end oil and gas exploration. In the decades since, Denmark has taken a leading role in the race to a clean energy future, primarily through the development of offshore wind. Currently, about 50% of electricity is supplied by wind and solar, and the goal in Denmark is to generate all electricity from renewable resources by 2030, be carbon neutral by 2045 and to achieve not just 100%, but 110% carbon reduction by 2050. Earlier this year, a group of European and North Sea countries signed what is called the Austin Declaration, which set a target of 120 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 and 300 gigawatts by 2050. Next slide. So on the trip, we asked ourselves, we had a lot of interactions with leaders there, but we asked ourselves, what are really the key factors that are making Denmark's approach to clean energy so unique? And there were four things that jumped out at us. First, culture. May not be a surprise to you, but Denmark has a relatively homogeneous population with a significant social welfare system and a strong sense of common good. And I think there's also a really strong sense there of self-determination as well as independence. And I think that's evidenced by their desire for energy independence. In addition, there's just strong alignment, as we saw in our discussions there, between business, government, and education. So really you have all stakeholders come to the table with a shared sense of purpose. Secondly is the historical context. The strong historical context in particular, with a focus on energy, began, as I mentioned earlier, with the 1973 oil crisis, but also a long geopolitical history between Denmark and its Scandinavian neighbors, as well as mainland Europe, and of course, most recently with the war in Ukraine. The focus on energy started with the 73 oil crisis, when Denmark realized there was a real need to move away from imported oil and to become energy independent. With the discoveries in the North Sea, of course, Denmark became a major producer of oil and gas, and then only recently has transitioned to clean energy, but with that same focus of independence, which brings us into our next key factor here, which is energy security. Security of supply has been a significant driver of Danish energy policy really for the past 50 years, and no more so than following the Russian invasion of Ukraine last year in 2022, which, as you know, led to significant decrease in Russian natural gas imports to Europe, an increase in natural gas prices globally, and power prices throughout the EU. And then lastly, but not unrelated, is economics, both in terms of managing energy costs, which tend to be fairly high, but also the Danish view of energy, particularly of clean energy, and clean energy technologies as an export and economic development opportunity and economic driver is a critical part of their energy strategy, which I'll talk about more later. Next slide. So one of the things we took away from the trip was the high degree of engagement that customers have in Denmark with their energy consumption. As I mentioned, electric costs play a huge role in driving customer behavior and awareness of consumption. In the summer of 2021, Danish residential electric costs, including taxes, were about 34.5 cents a kilowatt hour, 34.5 cents. And a significant portion of that, as you can see in the pie chart, is made up by taxes and other charges. However, despite this, we found that many Danes to be fairly accepting, not only of the high cost of electricity, but also because of the availability of detailed consumption information, pricing information. Many Danes are checking the price of electricity on a daily basis to plan their future consumption, particularly for times when costs are low. For example, one person we talked to would check an app to see when it might be an opportune time to charge their EV, and then they may choose to charge that based on when the prices are lowest. It also translates very similarly, although not electric, into fuel prices. And we saw many Danes choosing to commute by bicycle and other things rather than driving, in part due to the cost, but also for environmental reasons. Next slide. And so, as I mentioned before, not only is Denmark developing a green energy economy to meet these decarbonization targets that it set, but it is also squarely focused on doing so while also driving economic growth. You can see that beyond the typical decarbonization targets that we might see elsewhere, in Denmark they've set targets of reducing carbon emissions domestically by 100% by 2045, but as I mentioned before, going a step beyond to 110% by 2050. They refer to this not only as decarbonizing themselves, but also decarbonizing others. But it's a really deliberate play to develop a clean energy production for economic export to their neighboring countries. Denmark is developing 2 energy islands of 5 anticipated throughout the Baltic and North Sea, each of which is anticipated to support significant offshore wind development, as well as other clean energy resources such as green hydrogen and ammonia or others. And besides export, production of excess clean energy is also an attempt to attract industry to the North Sea area, seeking cheaper and cleaner electricity. An example would be data centers, many of which are locating in Denmark and the other Scandinavian countries. So this view of green energy or clean energy as an economic driver is really shared across the Danish government and the private sector, as well as the population as a whole. And they see this as a real opportunity not only to do well, but to do good. Next slide. So as I mentioned on the last slide, part of this strategy is around this circular economy and power to X. So part of Denmark's strategy for its development of wind resources is to use the excess generation when it's not needed to produce electricity to make other low or zero carbon products, such as green hydrogen and e-fuels, or in CO2s captured from other processes and combined with hydrogen to make lower carbon liquid fuels and products. A couple of those are listed there on the slide on the right-hand side. Although typical wind farms might have 30% or 40% capacity factors in offshore wind, particularly in the North Sea, can be up to 60%. In addition, the North Sea is known for its weather, with average wind speeds over 22 miles per hour. So power to X creates additional value in the energy system, and in the Danish view of the energy system in 2 ways. When electric prices are low, there's a high level of renewable energy on the system. Electrolyzers will be used to produce hydrogen and these other products, creating and extracting the most value out of that resource at the time. However, when prices are high, typically corresponding to low levels of renewable energy, electrolyzers can ramp down or halt production. So it provides not only a new value stream that Denmark can use to produce and sell to its neighbors, it also allows for managing variability. It also provides an opportunity that is really created and driven by price signals, which allows those resources to be optimized depending on when the different value streams are the most profitable. And then lastly, power to X is part of Denmark's philosophy of developing what they call a circular economy, wherein the waste heat from electrolysis will be used in district heating or other applications, and captured CO2 is combined with hydrogen to produce e-fuels, as I mentioned before. So they really do see this as from a holistic perspective, rather than from a single resource or a single end use perspective. Next slide. So I mentioned it briefly earlier, but I think the topic of energy security bears returning to. As you're aware, in 2022, the Russian invasion of Ukraine really sent shockwaves throughout Europe, which was heavily reliant on natural gas at the time. In fact, in some countries in Europe, there were discussions of cross-border energy export limitations. For Denmark, this was really reminiscent of the oil shock and a reminder of the value of energy independence. That being said, much of Denmark's energy security actually comes not from self-supply, but from the diversity of supply that it has access to through its ties to the European system. Ready access to hydropower resources in Norway, coal and gas fired generation from Germany, and although nuclear is not permitted in Denmark, access to nuclear generated electricity from Sweden and France is also part of this picture. In addition, access to a diversity of supply has enabled the country to manage the intermittency of renewables, primarily its offshore wind renewables, with the interties to Denmark's neighbors, which really allows the grid in a sense to act as a battery. And as a result of this, security of supply as well as system reliability are very, very good in Denmark, well above 99%. Public support also allows for investments such as widespread undergrounding, which also plays, as you imagine, a significant role. Next slide. So I'll just leave you with 4 takeaways that that we were asking ourselves. Really, what are the lessons learned from a U.S. utility perspective? So there's 4 things that I'll mention briefly. The first is this broad commitment among stakeholders, and it really was clear to us in visiting that the broad commitment within Danish society was really enabling for them. Well, what does that mean for us here in the U.S.? For U.S. utilities, it often means taking a look at how consensus can be built with communities, regulators, and other stakeholders. to define those common visions and develop that broad consensus around those energy transition plans. Secondly, we should consider how investments in clean technology or other programs can create additional value between what we consider to be traditional utility energy products or value streams. How can the clean energy transition benefit a region or community, including workforce development or economic development or other types of things? We see this as energy as economic development rather than energy for economic development. And then third, electrification presents a huge opportunity for the energy industry, as I'm sure you're aware, but it's not just an opportunity to benefit from the transition, it's also an opportunity to lead in an economy-wide transition. It's really an opportunity to do well and to do good. And then lastly, I'll wrap up by saying that I think that the utility industry, very much like one of our takeaways from an Australia trip that we did last year, has the opportunity to position itself as a driving force rather than simply a supporter of the clean energy transition. Part of this means taking more risk, having conversations with regulators, and being willing to move forward without all of the answers, which we know are few and fleeting at the time. So with that, I'll wrap up, and Kristen, I'll pass it back to you.
Great, thanks very much, Kevin. All right, next slide, please. So our next topic is developments at FERC. Next slide, please. Josh Kimec, who is a partner in our Raleigh office, is going to lead this discussion. He's been with ScottMadden's since 2014, and much of his work is focused on grid transformation and the integration of ERs. Josh?
Thanks, Kristen. Next slide, please. And so, as mentioned, we'll be talking a little bit about some developments in FERC in the past year, and especially as they relate to transmission. And it's been I think probably a running joke in the Scott Madden office for the past couple of years that transmission is cool again. And no doubt that's the case in 2023 as well. So we'll touch a little bit on interconnection reform, as well as planning criteria and standards for extreme heat and cold, and cybersecurity as well. Next slide, please. So starting with interconnection, I think it's important to frame the problem at least a little bit, and many are certainly probably familiar. But looking at interconnection queues across the US, even back a couple decades, if you look from the year 2000 to 2017, only 21% of projects that entered the queue in that time period have reached commercial operations, with the bulk withdrawing from the queue. And there's a number of different reasons for that. There's long interconnection study times and restudy as projects drop out or things change. There's just a high cost of interconnection in some cases. There's many what we call speculative projects in the queue that are very unlikely to come to fruition, but are still holding up queues in different ISOs and RTOs and utilities. And cumulatively, that has presented certainly a challenge that we've seen all across the nation to different degrees. And I think the other thing that's important, so it's clearly a throughput problem, but as I draw maybe attention to the graphic on the right, I think there's also a scale problem. We think about just the size or how much capacity is in the queue today. And the graphic on the far right, you can see total installed capacity in the US today is roughly 1,200 gigawatts. There's another almost 2,000 gigawatts of capacity in the queue right now. And that's across the country. There are some areas where this is certainly a whole lot more acute. California being an example where there's around 500 gigawatts in the queue, and that's I think over 10 times the peak load in California. So, obviously load and demand doesn't necessarily equal capacity, and we're talking about a lot of intermittent resources, but still just stepping back, the scale of what's looking to interconnect is enormous. And that raises some bigger questions of not just getting it through the queue, but how are we able to build all the transmission and infrastructure needed to interconnect these resources? So I think those problems are certainly intertwined, and maybe a discussion for another day. But we'll focus on interconnection reform specifically. Next slide, please. And so interconnection reform really took shape in 2023 with FERC Order 2023, aptly named. And it did a few things to address some of those problems I just mentioned. First, creating a first ready, first served cluster process to study interconnection. So looking at multiple interconnections all at once holistically instead of sequentially as they come in. And that helps shorten windows for studies and in some of those challenges. And also along with those clusters, Order 2023 sets in place a cost allocation for interconnection costs to be borne by those clusters and shared in a few different ways across, depending on what the upgrade is. So it can potentially relieve some of that financial burden that one project might face in order to upgrade that a lot of others behind them in the queue would benefit from. And finally, 2023 also gave more clarity and simplified some of the financial commitments that potential generators had to put into the queue, as well as raise the requirements for site control, kind of all getting at trying to eliminate some of those speculative projects that would sit in the queue and certainly slow it down. As a whole, these are certainly meaningful improvements to queues. I think I would add, though, that these are things that when we look at different ISOs and RTOs, utilities, jurisdictions, have been moving towards many of these things to one degree or another. So I think it's important to, when thinking about Order 2023, and I've heard it explained this way by a number of folks, is it really sets the floor. It sets the minimum of what the expectation should be for a queue to keep things moving along and to address some of the issues we've seen over the past couple decades. But it's not some transformative order that now, all this capacity in the queues today is somehow going to be connected over the next few years. It's still that volume challenge remains, even getting through some of this remains. But that said, it is all movement in the right direction and sets a minimum standard across the country to keep interconnection queues moving. Next slide, please. So turning our attention to extreme weather events and specifically extreme heat and cold. So looking back, and I think most folks here are probably aware, over the past few years, we've seen an increase in both the number and severity of extreme weather events, and acknowledging this in some probably most recent examples, Winter Storm Elliott, which we saw in the Southeast about 5 gigawatts of rolling blackouts in late December of last year. And then maybe looking back only a little bit further to February of 2021 and Winter Storm Uri, in which over 2/3 of Texans saw some kind of electric outage, and with that average being over 42 hours. So, some very significant outages, in that case, resulting in at least 246 deaths, likely many more. It's very understandable, FERC raising not just the frequency, but the impact of some of these extreme heat and cold events and how they could impact the grid. And given all that, FERC Order 896 is directing NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, to create new or modified reliability standards, and that includes transmission system planning for both extreme heat and cold. And I think a couple of things that jump out about how those, or aspects of those standards and what will be incorporated, is the use of one is the use of benchmark events for planning. So I think what it does is, going back to FERC's acknowledgement of some of these events getting more frequent and extreme, looking backwards in order to plan may not be the answer anymore. And rather than looking at historical data, looking at specific benchmarks of events and what was the impact of this specific one, and planning for those type of events rather than just looking at historical data is obviously a more forward-looking approach to what we expect to see impact the grid in years to come. I think what's also important to acknowledge here is, you can't plan for the transmission system in a bubble. A lot of these events have multiple impacts, not just to the transmission system, electric distribution system, but also generators. And when we talk about fuel supplies, particularly natural gas, these are all concurrent impacts in these events. And FERC acknowledges that, and the standards themselves would incorporate that in. And just to reinforce that, looking to the right, in NERC's most recent emerging risks survey, you can see that a number of the key issues that folks identified are either related directly to extreme weather events or other items such as resource adequacy that become a major factor during these events. So what we can expect going forward, the requirement from NERC is to provide these standards by the end of next year. And then following that, there's a year for those standards to go into place. So not immediately, but what we see on the horizon is some changes in planning to think about what the weather and extreme weather impacts will be going forward. Next slide, please. And then finally, turning to cybersecurity, coming from the bipartisan infrastructure law, one of the requirements was for FERC to develop incentives for advanced cybersecurity. And what really that is kind of, if you want to think about the carrot approach, to encourage utilities to be proactive in cybersecurity. So this is above all the compliance requirements, but looking for utilities to do more around advanced cybersecurity and cybersecurity technology. And one key thing to think about this order here is that definition of what advanced cybersecurity technology is. And you can see it in the bottom of the screen there. And it is somewhat vague. As this is implemented, FERC will maintain a list of pre-qualified technologies and solutions for cybersecurity that are considered advanced. And in addition, utilities on a case-by-case basis can apply to have other tailored solutions, meet the criteria for this. So, while the intent is clear, what it looks like in practice, there's still a lot that remains to be seen. And next slide, please. And just looking at eligibility itself. So as mentioned, this incentive is for utilities to materially improve their cybersecurity and also promote information sharing. It's for voluntary activities, so things that aren't mandated or already required. However, proactively meeting requirements that haven't gone into place yet does qualify until they are requirements. So in some ways, it's an incentive to comply early as well. And the incentive is, I guess, fairly typical for a utility that allow these investments, these proactive cybersecurity investments, to be treated as regulatory assets. So the utility will be able to earn on that investment over an amortization period of 5 years. And I think the key takeaway for this is, again, it's solving, or at least focusing on two issues as they relate to cybersecurity: moving the ball forward in terms of technology and solutions, and not just meeting the bare minimum of compliance for utilities, and also the information sharing part, which is critical not just for utilities but across industry, that in order to really keep up with emerging cybersecurity threats from myriad sources. Next slide, please. So maybe backing up, some takeaways from some of FERC's activity as it relates to transmission over the past year. First is, I think we've kind of discussed the three orders that we went through between interconnection, extreme weather, and cybersecurity. They take aim at challenges that are very real today, and there are meaningful improvements in all cases. However, they are not, when we think about some of the other big problems, I guess going back to just the sheer volume of transmission infrastructure needed to meet clean energy goals and the clean energy transition, these are not things that are necessarily transformative orders, but rather setting the stage, setting the foundation, setting the bare minimums in order to address problems today. Second, implementation is not going to take place overnight, and I think that's true for most any FERC order or regulation within transmission, but the timelines for these planning standards will not be out to the end of next year. The Order 2023's implementation and interconnection reforms don't take place till sometime in the middle of next year. And then even for cybersecurity, those standards will evolve over time as FERC deems what's advanced cybersecurity. So again, nothing tomorrow, but gradual, meaningful improvement. And it's important to keep in mind that this is on top of other efforts at ISOs, RTOs, utilities related to recent FERC orders, whether it be the integration aggregation of DERs in FERC Order 2222, ambient temperature line ratings in Order 881. So from a utility ISO RTO perspective, this is still a lot of change in processes and systems in order to comply with kind of the myriad orders that are stacking up over the past few years in transmission. And then finally, looking ahead, there may be potentially some more transformative change on the horizon. The main piece that I think a lot of folks are anticipating potentially next year is an order out of FERC on transmission planning and cost allocation, which may at least start to tackle that big challenge of how do you build all the transmission that's needed, potentially in a proactive way, and allocate costs in order to make that happen. And then the other big challenge, potentially addressed by FERC or through Congress, is permitting reform, just being able to actually build the transmission needed. And there's been a number of bills that have come up in Congress or initiatives over time, and they seem to be start-stop, and I will not sit here and predict what Congress will do in 2024, but I think it's a topic that's not going away and has the potential to gain some traction next year as well. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Kristen.
Thanks, Josh. And transmission most definitely is cool again, so thank you for that. All right, next slide, please. So our third topic is virtual power plants. Next slide, please. Sarah Vondracek is going to speak to this topic, and she is a manager out of our Raleigh office. Sarah joined us in 2020 and has spent much of the last couple of years working on integrated distribution planning. With that, I'll turn it over to her. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Kristen. Next slide. And today I'll be talking about virtual power plants and talking to Kristen, sort of thinking about whether or not these are going to be a real major player in the grid going forward, and talk to you how it can be used. But before we get into that, I think a good question to start off with is, what is a virtual power plant, otherwise known as a VPP? And VPPs are aggregations of distributed energy resources, or DERs, that can balance both supply and demand on the energy system. And together they truly do act as a utility scale and utility grade asset, just like a traditional power plant. So what does that really mean in practice? The traditional power grid is shown here in the gray boxes at the top of the screen. Again, there's generation, where electricity flows, to transmission, distribution, and finally to the end consumer in the purple box at the bottom of the screen. And this is where a lot of the change is happening right now in the grid. As you can see, there's a lot of different types of DERs that are being adopted by customers, a lot of different types of technologies. For example, there's solar PV, there's energy storage, smart thermometers, water pumps. Truly, the list goes on of all the different DERs that are being taken on to the grid at the consumer level. Now, the VPP comes into play, this purple box on the right-hand side, and they really, combine all these different DERs together and really using them talk to the grid operators and allow them to operate as a single unit and provide different benefits to the grid and really orchestrate the DER usage. And due to the nature of grouping these DERs together, they really create a flexible tool that has a high level of dexterity. And there are 4 different benefits of the DERs being used in this sort of combined way. The first off is that they can shift the load. So moving load from the peak demand to off-peak demand. The second one is shedding. So just reducing the amount of energy demand at a specific use in time. For example, if you kick on on-site power, that site's no longer going to use as much electricity. The third one is shaping the curve, so really just flattening out the overall electricity curve. And finally is providing ancillary services. Next slide, please. And VPPs are already, producing a lot of benefits to the grid today. There are quite a few of them already being run in North America. You can see here that Wood Mackenzie counted up all the various different VPPs in play, and there are about 500 right now in North America. The most common types of VPPs are on the left-hand side, smart thermostats and direct load control. These are really demand response programs and have a history in demand response that are now being adapted and used together as a VPP, and they decrease the consumption of that end user. Example is a smart thermostat. For example, on a really hot day, a VPP can use a smart thermostat to reduce the amount of AC that an end consumer is using, and collectively, really reduce the amount of energy that's being used by the end consumer. Now, altogether, VPP capacity in the United States is about 30 to 60 gigawatts right now. And with expansion, the DOE does estimate that this could increase to about 80 to 160 gigawatts by 2030. And that's about 10 to 20% of peak load. So that can make quite a big impact in a number of years. Next slide. Now, what's all the hype about VPPs? Really, the hype is that there's a lot of different value propositions that they bring because of their diversity and the different types of DERs that can be deployed. And that's really, again, because of their functionality. They can serve as demand, load, and storage, depending on the types of DERs that are part of the configuration. And they also have the ability to be able to really be tailored to a specific time or location or scale, again, all depending on how they're designed. And they can really help out with a lot of the struggles on the grid right now. The first off being resource adequacy, certainly an issue right now on the grid. And VPPs can support by, first off, shifting demand to meet supply, so really matching demand to meet that supply curve, and also integrating a larger amount of distributed energy generation and storage capacity. The second is affordability. These, again, can help by reducing the amount of capital expenditure for large-scale projects, both with transmission and distribution, and also generation. They also can really help the end customer by, giving the benefits of those different DERs to the consumers themselves, because they're the ones that are deploying them and largely owning them. The third one is reliability and resiliency. Again, this is the integration of backup power, so thinking of those energy storage units, et cetera, and eliminating a single point of failure because of the distributed nature of this solution. The fourth item is decarbonization. So really thinking about bringing on all of these new distributed renewable generation sources. VPPs can also help because they can reduce the curtailment of renewables by, again, making sure that the demand curve now matches that renewable curve of generation. The fourth is T&D infrastructure relief. Again, VPPs can help by smoothing out the different peaks and also reducing congestion on the grid because of this more local dispatchable DER solution. The second to last item is community empowerment. Again, this is a really key one for thinking about the stakeholders that are going to be engaged with VPPs going forward. Customers and working with utilities can really design the virtual power plants to meet the needs of the consumers. So really fitting this design to meet their needs, their wants, et cetera, and also can support local jobs in the communities. And finally, there's a lot of versatility and flexibility. Hopefully I'm emphasizing that point. VPPs can certainly be designed to fit the needs of a specific grid, a specific time. They can also be redesigned over time. So if the needs of a specific area, utility do evolve, VPPs can evolve with them. So again, across the board, there's a lot of different value that VPPs can give to the utility system. Next slide, please. Now, thinking about future growth of virtual power plants, there are, again, a lot of different drivers that are looking to support VPP growth going into the future. The first off is early success. There have been quite a lot of different pilots, programs, et cetera, that have been successfully deploying VPPs for years, and this has allowed utilities and vendors to really refine and enhance the offerings that they provide, such that the next time that there's a pilot, et cetera, hopefully be a little bit better for both the utility and the end consumer. The second one is market access. In September 2020, FERC issued ERC 2222 that aimed to better enable the participation of DERs and regional grid operators by requiring RTOs and ISOs to amend the rules to allow for the heterogeneous DER aggregations in wholesale markets. So again, this is yet another market space that VPPs will be able to play in the future once that gets done. The third item here is the diversity of the technology. Again, there are a lot of different DERs that can be used in VPP designs. Some of them are more mature, for example, the smart thermostats, et cetera, in the demand response area. But there are quite a few different emerging technologies that can be used going forward. For example, the bidirectional charge of electric vehicles. The next item is federal tax credits. So again, hopefully you're aware that the IRA was passed recently, and there are quite a lot of different energy tax credits that can be provided to the different types of DERs that are included in VPPs. For example, electric vehicles, heat pumps, and this is only going to increase the adoption rates going forward. Which gets to the critical mass. There is becoming a higher and higher adoption rates for all the different DERs that I'm talking about today. For example, certainly the energy storage system rates, even on the residential side, have been increasing almost exponentially over the past few years. And this is consistent across the board. Finally, reliability concerns. Again, certainly this is top of mind for a lot of folks that there's resource capacity shortfalls and certainly energy risks that have been highlighted by many different reports. And folks also have top of mind of all the different, big storm events or summer storm events that have really been impacting end consumers' reliability of the electricity that they're receiving. And folks are really thinking to different solution sets. Next slide, please. So VPPs, as we discussed, are already at a pretty impressive scale, and there are quite a few of different examples across the United States. We listed 4 here on this slide, but there's certainly even more listed in our EIU, so I definitely would encourage you to take a look at that if you're interested in the different types of programs that are available. The 4 that we listed here, I'd like to highlight all the different types of DERs that are included in the different programs, and there's also a lot of different program designs. I think one helpful analogy that I've heard of when thinking about how VPPs can design is that of a sandwich menu. So really thinking about that there's a real set structure for how these can be done and thinking through the different options at each of the levels. So bread, meat, cheese, whatever it may be. But instead in the VPPs, the options are thinking through, okay, what DERs am I going to include? What incentive structure am I going to include for my consumers? What's the vendor structure going to be? And going through one by one and figuring out what is the best design that meets the needs. The one that I will highlight today is that of Vermont. Green Mountain Power has one of the oldest VPP programs in the United States. And right now they have about 5,000 different batteries located at the homes, about 3,000 customers. And that program is designed to help produce energy during peak demand periods. And recently, the program was expanded because of the extreme interest in the Tesla Powerwall program. They had a waitlist out until 2026, and they decided to expand the program to allow more consumers into it because of that large interest. Tesla's virtual power plant has saved Vermont residents about $3 million in peak costs in a single year, and it also helped to keep the lights on in winter storms, which is what it was designed to do. These units together, just for scale, have a total capacity of about 27 megawatts. Again, this is one example, and I would definitely encourage you to read our EIU to see all the different examples that are out there. Next slide, please. Now thinking through all the various different takeaways, we've summarized these all into 4 different areas of takeaways for VPPs. The first off is that VPPs are proliferating today. Hopefully I've conveyed to you that there's already quite a few of them out there in North America, and that's largely due to the adoption of DERs to date, and also the changing regulatory space that will allow future adoption. The second off is that VPPs offer broad value proposition. So again, because of the various different types of DERs, they can provide both demand, generation, and storage depending on what's included. And again, these can be changed over time to evolve in the design to meet the needs of the utility. The third takeaway is that there are still strong tailwinds that for even additional growth in the future. There are a lot of different pushes, both with the early programs having success, and also, the benefits that these programs can provide to utilities. There's going to be significant growth in these DERs going forward, so this is definitely a space to watch. And with all this growth and potential expansion of VPPs, utilities can certainly take steps to prepare for VPPs going forward. Certainly creating a strategic plan would be a good idea right now. The first would be to assess, how VPPs may provide value to you. Again, there's a lot of different options out there to truly think what would make the most sense for the grid, what concerns are there in reliability right now. The second would be to start engaging with regulators and market stakeholders to really hear what their wants and desires are, and also to provide education on these topics. And last but not least, to identify proactive investments on the system to prepare for this expansion of DERs going forward. And with that, I'll pass it back to Kristen.
All right, thank you very much, Sarah. And if we could bring our other panelists back. I know, speaking for myself, we've been hearing about VPPs, particularly from the DOE this year, but until we did the research, I did not realize the degree to which they were showing up in so many parts of the country. So it was eye-opening for me personally. So we have started to get some questions in. And Kevin, I'm going to go to you first. We had a question about the retail rate for electricity in Denmark. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, sure, happy to. So as I mentioned during the presentation, in 2021, that retail rate was around 34.5 cents a kilowatt hour. Since then, prices have gone up, as we discussed, and prices now are about around 41 cents a kilowatt hour, which puts Denmark in the top 4 or 5 in terms of European countries in terms of their retail rates. Now, I will mention about half of that, or actually over half of that, is made up of excise and VAT tax.
Yeah, thanks for that. So while we're on Denmark, and Kevin, this will go to you again, after that trip, there are a lot of attributes to Denmark that make it pretty unique, both in terms of energy systems and even in terms of its European neighbors. As you think about those attributes that make it most able to advance its energy goals, how would you describe those?
Yeah, it's really a combination of things, and it's interesting. They clearly have an advantage in having a smaller population, a smaller country, so they're able to develop these really expansive resources that meet their energy needs, but also allow them to develop excess capacity to export to other countries. And then just the societal support for doing so. And there really is a willingness and a broad consensus in the country to not just go clean, but to do this in a way that's economically advantageous. And I think it really bears mentioning again how interconnected they are to their neighbors. Because I think if they were really islanded, or if they had a less interconnected system, a lot of the optionality and flexibility that they have in terms of resources wouldn't allow them to do some of the things that they're attempting to do.
Yeah, agreed. I was personally very surprised at how willing they were to pay such high taxes. And there's a social construct that supports it, but it would be very difficult to get that done here. We did get a question that I'm going to attempt to answer. So it was about the degree to which planned or dynamic load shedding fit into FERC and NERC risk management planning. So this could go a lot of different ways. To my knowledge, and again, I'll emphasize that that's limited in some of these things, but we have not seen FERC and NERC come forward with standards around load shedding. What we're seeing instead is much more of what Sarah described in terms of opportunities to make the load side or the demand side more fungible. So opportunities exist for companies to come in and serve as that aggregator role, and that is of value to utilities and RTOs and ISOs to address some of the capacity constraints we're seeing. We've seen, places like Texas and California go out for demand response events during very, very high load periods, and we are seeing responsiveness. Again, after a number of days during a heat wave, people will get tired of that. But I do think that we're seeing more and more products show up on that side, given all the constraints that we're seeing on the grid at the moment. Let's see. So over to Josh. We got a question about extreme weather. So do you see some of the same extreme weather concerns that we heard you speak to on the transmission side show up on the distribution side of the house?
Most definitely, and maybe even more so. I think some may argue that the transmission is catching up a little bit to what's been going on the distribution side, where we're seeing more of an emphasis on resiliency, whether it be kind of in the more traditional approaches within rate cases and justifying distribution investment, or things like integrated distribution plans where resiliency is a factor in driving what a utility would propose. And probably one of the best examples that's happening in real time is in the state of New York, where all the investor-owned utilities in September filed climate change vulnerability studies looking ahead, using the climate change science to identify where the grid may be impacted by climate change. And then next week, all those same utilities will be filing climate change resilience plans based off of those vulnerabilities to mitigate the impacts of climate change. And a big part of that is extreme weather and thinking about how to invest in the grid when looking at that going forward. And then maybe I'll just quickly add one more piece that I think applies to both distribution and transmission. When we look forward to a world where we assume some significant electrification of heating and transportation in areas where it isn't already, then electricity becomes an even more essential resource. And resiliency becomes even more important, where you're not just relying on electricity for, say, cooling or power in the house, but also now, heating in extreme cold and being able to get around with a vehicle. So for all those reasons, I think it's coming to the forefront, both at the distribution level and transmission and generation as well.
Yep. Thanks, Josh. Okay, for Sarah, you mentioned 500 VPPs in the US today. Are these individual sites or organizations supporting multiple sites?
Sure, yes, that 500 VPP projects language came from a recent Wood Mackenzie study. And essentially these 500 VPP projects would have multiple different end consumers that are combined together again into that one VPP. And they gave a pretty broad definition of what a VPP is. So this would also include historic demand response programs as well.
Gotcha, okay, thank you for that. So carrying on with you, Sarah, you talked about some of the drivers of VPP growth, but what do you see as some of the challenges or barriers that we're going to experience as they expand?
Certainly, yeah. So thinking about the challenges, certainly one of them is just the very nature of the fact that they are so integrated and have a lot of customer data in them. And that has challenges in both thinking about one, setting up programs that have the same system and can communicate to each other pretty easily and can react very quickly to these needs and wants of the grid. So setting up a system with that interoperability plan is certainly a challenge, but doable going forward. And the second one is the cybersecurity of that, right? Again, there's a lot of different points of customer data that are involved in these systems, and making sure that it's set up that customer end data is safe and secure and there's no issues with that. Above and beyond the tech side, again, certainly making sure customers are aware of this is a challenge. Again, as I was thinking through this, I'm not even sure exactly all the different programs that are available in my region. So that's a challenge, and folks should definitely think through how to reach out to the end consumer to make sure that they're aware of them. But certainly some challenges, but definitely doable and things to get done over the next few years to get more and more VPPs out there.
Yeah, living in this industry, I would be hard pressed to understand what was available to me in the region where I live. So I hear you. Okay, so Kevin, I want to return to the conversation you started about P to X. And as I think about that in the conversations we had in Denmark, it seems like that strategy makes the Danes highly dependent on being able to ship clean molecules to other countries. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and it's a really good observation, because I think that the business case for developing all this excess renewable energy is very dependent, obviously, on their ability to commoditize that and sell it, to export it, to sell to their neighbors. I think their strategy, really is multi-pronged. So on one hand, they're looking at both electricity, but also hydrogen or P2X exports, but at the same time looking to make the investment climate more attractive. I mean, climate literally, but the investment, the market in Denmark attractive for industries like data centers and other things that are looking to maybe relocate to that region. I will say, there's been a lot since we visited in June. There's been a lot of discussion. I think you may be familiar with some of the price increases that have taken place within wind, and has sunk some of those, particularly in North America, some of those deals. So I think there may be more headwinds there, not to make a pun, for offshore wind and for this renewable development than there has been in the past. And we'll have to see if they tailor their strategy or modify that in any way to accommodate those changes.
The cost is going to challenge everyone on that. So let's see, going back to Sarah, question came in: before talking to building owners, utilities need to understand what problems or challenges they're trying to solve. How do you think about how the utility needs to address that question? You mentioned communications being one.
Yeah, now thinking about, again, not just a residential customer that owns their home, there are a lot of different folks that can deploy DERs and eventually VPPs. So certainly a challenge for utilities and vendors to think through how they communicate to the different types of end consumers that are out there. Again, really getting to the first question of why. For example, again, in Vermont, they were trying to make sure that the lights don't go out on extreme weather days in the cold time. So thinking through what is that program trying to address? What is that peak load that they're trying to reduce is step one for utilities. But certainly second is thinking through how are they going to get different types of consumers engaged and involved. For example, building managers is certainly a good case of, if I'm renting and I have a building manager, again, what are they doing? I'm not quite sure. So some different models that are out there is that DERs do have, some of them have automatic adoption. So if it comes to your doorstep, a nest, maybe it's automatically adopted into a program. So that's one way that folks are trying to get increased engagement without having the burdensome sort of education. Again, opting out is always an option, but one case of a model that's been really successful for folks. Another one is just thinking through the incentive models. Again, so how are people getting the money, the dollars for enrolling their DER into a VPP and making sure that it's meaningful to the end consumer to go through the effort to educate themselves to, put their DER into that VPP group. So some considerations before reaching out to a specific building of thinking through the why and the how that different players are going to be engaged and involved in the structure of the VPP.
Thank you for that. So last question is going to go to Josh. So on the FERC orders that you talked about, you described them as kind of incremental improvements rather than transformative. Can you speak to why you would say that?
Well, I think it goes back to that a lot of the orders we saw or the three we mentioned in particular, looking at problems that exist today in addressing those kind of immediate things. But I'd point to all of the challenges that the transmission in the industry faces to meet federal goals, the clean energy transition, that these maybe move the needle on, but aren't the answer to get to where, certainly the government, the administration thinks we need to be. And maybe one specific example of that is the recent DOE study on transmission needs to meet goals. And by 2035, that study said that we need 20% to 128% more regional transmission and 25 to 412% interregional transmission. Getting through an interconnection queue, solving some of these problems doesn't get us there. And we'll see what happens next year. Maybe transmission planning and cost allocation order would be more transformative to meet the need that I think it was, maybe a couple of years ago, folks would say that the thing that nobody's talking about is the transmission need in all of this. I think that's changed some. Transmission certainly in the conversation, but I don't know if we've seen the action yet on transmission planning, cost allocation, siting and permitting reform to actually make it happen yet.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And I think you said it well when you said that it was a floor, not a ceiling in terms of improvements. So with that, thank you all very much. I'm going to turn it back to PJ. If you all have not received our EIU or have not read it yet, I encourage you to download it here using this QR code. There are 3 additional topics that we didn't speak to today that include the proposed EPA power plant rule, natural gas utility decarbonization, gas and power coordination, as well as our industry and charts, which in this edition focuses on electric vehicles. So with that, I will turn it back to you, PJ. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you, panel. Fantastic presentation. For our audience, we hope you've enjoyed today's discussion. As you log off, please take a moment to complete our survey and give us your feedback so we can continue to provide you with quality content. Thank you for attending. This concludes today's presentation.